Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today we have a hand from a side event at the PokerStars Caribbean Adventure. We are early in the day, 200-400 blinds with 30,000 effective chip stacks. A splashy player limps from the hijack seat, and this is an excellent spot to raise with a wide range, and especially with your best hands. An ace-jack suited certainly counts as a strong hand whenever you're facing a splashy limper. When I do raise here, it's usually going to be to about 1,500, roughly a tiny bit less than the size of the pot. A pot size raise would be to 1,800. You do 3 times the last bet, which is 400, plus any additional dead money in the pot, which is 600. So that's 1,200 plus 600, which is 1,800. So that's how you know what a pot size bet is. And we're going to make it a little bit less because we are in position. From out of position, I'd be making it closer to 2,000. And I'm going to do that with my whole range just to be generally balanced. And I think in general, you want to have some fold equity when you're raising in this spot from the button because you just steal the pot immediately. Of course, with this hand, I don't really mind if my opponents call. And if I'm really trying to exploit my opponents, you can make it smaller with your good hands, like 1,200, and bigger with your junk hands if you think they're going to fold to bigger raise sizes. But I assume most players are competent enough to figure that out somewhat quickly. So anyway, I make it 1,500, and now the small blind, big blind, and hijack all call. A lot of players look at this and think, oh my God, what a disaster. I've let all these people in the pot. But really, it's fine. This hand in particular is going to have way more equity than our opponent's hands. And also, we're in position. Having position is going to let us win way more than 25% of the time, which is what we need to win, by the way. We put in 25% of the money in the pot. Actually, a little bit less because there are antes in the pot. So, just off the top of my head, we're probably going to end up winning this pot like 33% of the time, and we put in 25% of the money. So, this is going to work out very well for us in the long run. Flop comes ace-4-4, 2 diamonds. I have no diamonds. And they check to me. So now we have to ask, if I bet, can I get called by worse hands? And I think the answer is definitely yes. A lot of players will call with any ace, which we are beating for the most part. You'd have to assume most players are going to re-raise from the blinds with ace-king or ace-queen. So we can easily get called by all the worst aces. A lot of players aren't playing too many hands with a 4. Like, I don't think people are calling 1,500 chip raises with stuff like 8-4 offsuit, right? So really it's going to be hands like ace-4, maybe 7-4 suited, 6-4 suited, 5-4 suited, 4-3 suited. And that's about it. So there just aren't that many combinations of those hands. So I think we can be very happy betting here. If we bet and get raised, we're very unhappy. And if you get the vibe that's one of the players, when they check, likes their hand, you should definitely consider checking behind. Because really the only bad turn is a diamond. And even then it's not the end of the world. So you'd much prefer not to get check raised. But if you don't think you're going to get check raised too often, you should certainly bet for value. And you don't need to bet too big. Notice I do bet 2,000 into the 6,450 chip pot. Because we are trying to get value, right? If I bet something like 4,000, our opponents are going to start folding out most of their worst hands, and they're only going to call with an ace or a 4. And that's not really what I want here, because I'm barely ahead of the aces. Well, I am ahead of the aces, but I also just lose all the 4s. So I think a 2,000 bet will get called by under pairs, flush draws, maybe even gut shot straight draws, like 5-3 suited and whatnot. So the splashy player calls, which is great. That's definitely the player you want to have call, because he is going to have all sorts of junk, like, well, 5-3 suited and pocket 6s and stuff like that. So the turn's a 4, giving me a full house, which is fantastic. But now I have a little bit of a dilemma, because if I bet, my opponent's going to fold all of his draws, unless I bet really small, like 3,000, which I think is what I would bet if I was to bet. But he's going to fold out most of his draws to most reasonable bet sizes. And if he has a 4, he's obviously never folding. And if he has an ace, we're now chopping. So when we bet and get called, we're usually chopping or we lose. Unless he has a hand like pocket 6s, which he may. You have to assume most players are going to raise with their small pairs before, or their pairs before the flop. But I think our opponent certainly could have a few combinations of those hands, so I'm not going to totally discount them. But I think in general, when we bet here and get action, we're going to be chopping or we're going to be losing. So if we're chopping and we get action, that's, well, neutral. And if we are losing and we get action, that's awful. So this is a spot where I think we definitely want to check behind, because if our opponent does have a hand like pocket 6s, can I really count on him calling a turn bet and then calling a river bet? Like, probably not, right? But if it goes check on the turn and my opponent then checks on the river, maybe at that point he does decide to call with a hand like pocket 6s, thinking that I'm bluffing with a straight or a flush draw that missed. So this is a spot where I definitely like checking. You do miss a little bit of value sometimes, but the only way we're going to play a big pot here is if our opponent has an ace or a 4 and we're chopping or losing in that situation. So this is a great spot to check. Or bet tiny, like I said, like 3,000 or 2,500. River's the king. And the opponent leads for 5,000. All right, so if he has an ace and I raise, will he ever fold? That's the first question you want to ask yourself. So can we make him fold a chop? And versus a splashy guy, I'm not counting on this guy folding an ace, so that's not realistic. If he has a 4, obviously we are crushed. If he has a hand like pocket sixes and he decided to bet the river, which would not be a good play, but many players will he ever call if I raise? Probably not. So we're not really extracting value. Maybe there's some merit in min raising here to try to extract a little bit of value from those hands, but that's just so obvious that we're trying to get value. And I mean, if your opponent's that bad, I guess you can go for it, but I'm not really trying to make plays assuming our opponents are just absolutely horrible. But, sometimes your opponents are absolutely horrible. If you do min raise here and you get jammed on, you probably need to fold. So min raising does open you up to that. It would be a real disaster if your opponent looks at a hand like ace 9 and thinks, well, I have a full house, so I'm going to go all in now because my hand's obviously good. And then we sit here and we fold an ace. That would be a absolute disaster. So you don't want to let that happen. So anyway, I think this is a pretty nice spot to call. There certainly could be merit in raising. If this was not a tournament, meaning I could reload if I happen to lose this hand, I would probably go for a raise to something like 11,600 or so. I think that would be a nice size that our opponent may trick himself into thinking that we are bluffing. But in a tournament, I'm just going to call here pretty much every time. In tournaments, you typically want to take lower variance plays when the pot gets big on the turn and the river, because that's where you really open yourself up to going broke, and you do not want to go broke in tournaments. So our opponent shows up with 5-2 of spades. So notice what happened here is that we bet small on the flop, got called by absolute garbage, which is exactly what we wanted to have happen. On the turn, we checked, correctly understanding that if our opponent had this hand, he would never pay us off, right? He's just going to fold this on the turn, you would think. Or he's going to check raise and put me in an awful spot. I don't think I could really fold, so maybe we ended up costing ourselves some equity if our opponent would have lost his mind. But splashy does not necessarily mean overly aggressive. Splashy means they like to call a lot. So like I said, if I was to bet on the turn, I would have bet small, and for all I know, maybe the guy sticks around for another 3,000. But if he check calls the 3,000 on the turn, he's certainly not paying us off on the river because he has the nut low, or nearly the nut low. So as played, we actually got the guy to put 5,000 chips in on the river with absolutely nothing. And that's more than we would have gotten if we bet 3,000 on the turn. So this actually ended up working out very nicely for me. And we won a nice pot off of a hand that probably should not have been involved in the first place. I think if we took a slightly different line at any point, if we bet bigger on the flop, if we bet the turn, if we raised bigger before the flop, a lot of things could have happened that would have not allowed our opponent to make this mistake. And I think a lot of players are really concerned with protecting their hand by making their opponents fold out, stuff like this, but you really want to keep your opponents in, because here the guy was drawing just nearly dead, and he gave away a nice chunk of chips to us early in the tournament. So that's going to be it for this hand for PokerNews.com. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you check back next week for another educational poker hand. Thanks for watching.